Welcome to our talk on the sleeping tiger. The sleeping tiger is a model of chemical dependency that we've developed to help you understand the nature of progression in addiction. The sleeping tiger was developed specifically to help people understand the physical progression in the disease of alcoholism and or drug addiction. As you know, the American Medical Association discovered that alcoholism and or chemical dependency is a progressive disease. And a lot of people have a very difficult time understanding what progression means and what it doesn't mean. And we've seen a number of films and scientific studies that really outline what progression really means, but we thought we would develop a very simple model so that you could really understand the nature of progression in chemical dependency. When I use the term chemical dependency, what I'm really talking about is alcoholism, number one, drug dependency, number two, cocaine dependency, number three, marijuana or pot dependency, number four, or any kind of substance that alters the mind and the emotions, which attaches itself to an addiction. So I'm going to interchange the word alcoholism with chemical dependency, or I may use drug abuse, and it all means the same thing. It comes under the same umbrella, chemical dependency. One of the interesting things that we see in treatment of chemical dependency is people who are claiming to have one addiction but not another. I've met many alcoholics who claim they could successfully use drugs, and I've met many drug abusers who successfully claimed that they could use alcohol and vice versa. And what we really need to understand, as shown by this little chart here, that the addiction, which is what we associate with chemical dependency, is very similar to being on the ship of the Titanic. And obviously the Titanic, which includes a seat for alcoholism and a seat for drug abuse and a seat for cocaine use and a seat for pot use and heroin use and all of the other forms of chemical dependency, each one of these seats is on the Titanic. And of course the problem that we find with the Titanic some 50-odd some odd years ago is that the whole ship went down. So if one is claiming to be able to use one kind of chemical successfully, even though he or she can't use another, that's simply like switching seats on the Titanic. Be aware of the fact that when we talk about chemical dependency or addiction, we're talking about a condition that is inside of a person, not a drug. In other words, using my own life as an example, I'm an alcoholic and I've been abstinent for 15 years, but I'm addicted to any kind of mind-altering chemical that I can get my hands on. In other words, I don't differentiate between alcoholism and drug abuse and cocaine abuse and pot abuse. It's all the same thing. So immediately we begin to see that the problem is the Titanic, and the fact that it's going down is what causes people to not be able to recover successfully, whether it's from alcoholism or drug addiction, if they continue to use any kind of mind-altering substance. The disease of chemical addiction is threefold. In other words, there are three parts to it, and they need to be understood, and they need to be seen for what they are. With chemical dependency, we're talking about a physical addiction or a physical part of the illness. In other words, the alcoholic or the chemically dependent person is bodily different from other people. I'm an alcoholic, and my body chemistry is different from a non-alcoholic. I have a disease. It's called alcoholism. And my body chemistry is different from other folks, which makes me alcoholic physically. I have a physiological illness. The second part of the disease of chemical dependency is psychological. In other words, something has happened to me psychologically as a result of my addiction to alcohol, which causes me to have a real strong change in the way I think and in the way I deal with my feelings when it relates to my own chemical dependency. So the second part of addiction is psychological, and of course the third part, as you already know, is the spiritual part of addiction, which is the part of my addiction which forms itself in my own belief system, in my heart or my innermost self. So when we talk about chemical dependency, we're talking physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And in today's talk, we're simply going to zero in and focus on the physical or physiological part of the disease. Okay? In today's talk, we're going to really zero in on what does it mean to have a progressive illness, or what is the nature of chemical dependency in the human physical condition. And of course, we know that chemical dependency is chronic, which means it's lifelong. Once a person becomes chemically dependent, that person will continue to be so for the rest of that person's life. I have a lifelong condition. It's called alcoholism. There is no cure for it. What one can do is one can arrest the illness or put it to sleep or put it into remission. And due to the fact that I, in my own personal life, have not had a drink for 15 years, then obviously my disease of alcoholism has been in remission. Or sleeping for 15 years. It hasn't gone away. And there isn't any known cure for it. I can't take a pill and become non-alcoholic. I will be an alcoholic for the rest of my life because I have a chronic, lifelong illness. And the second part of my disease, physically, is irreversible. In other words, there isn't any way that my illness can be reversed. I can never become a non-alcoholic. You've all heard the story of the cucumber that gets turned into a pickle. And all of a sudden the pickle is asking, well, how can I become a cucumber again? And obviously the answer is, once a cucumber gets turned into a pickle, it will remain that way for the rest of its life. It's an irreversible chemical process that the cucumber went through. And once it's a pickle, it will have to be pickled for the rest of my life. So I guess I'm going to have to stay pickled for the rest of my life because I'm an alcoholic. See, I'm a chemically dependent person. The chronic, irreversible nature of chemical dependency is quite easy to understand. The third factor is the one that has a lot of mystery cloaked around it. There are many different understandings of progression. There are many different good papers written on it. There are many good films that have been developed that show chemically what happens inside of people who become chemically dependent, and progression is the hardest part of it to understand. So what we've done is we've developed a model of progression which relates to a tiger. And this tiger is rather unique. He lives inside of me. In other words, I have a tiger inside of me. He's located right about here, somewhere in my stomach. The problem is that my tiger is invisible to me. I can't see it. But the tiger represents my disease of chemical dependency, and it's in me even though I can't see it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transfer from you looking at me, and we're going to show you a series of pictures, and we could say that these pictures are a picture of me. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you through a real easy to understand story which demonstrates how progression works inside of a person who is chemically dependent. And it's really important that you understand this, and I'll tell you why. Most people who suffer from chemical dependency have a built-in forgetter. And it's kind of located right in between the left ear and the right ear, somewhere in this thing that we call the head. And the forgetter is very, very important to understand because it's given to us by nature to cause us to forget pain. And of course, one of the biggest problems that chemically dependent people suffer from is they forget how bad it used to be when we were using and drinking. And the built-in forgetter will cause you and I to forget how bad it really was the last time we drank in time, unless we do something to overcome the built-in forgetter, which is why we're offering this particular understanding. I know in my own particular life, this is how I overcame forgetting how bad it used to be, forgetting the fact that I was an alcoholic. And I used to do that very successfully. It would take me about 3 months of not drinking and not using drugs, and I would totally forget how bad it was the last time I drank. I would minimize the pain. I would minimize the degradation. I would minimize the shame. And interestingly enough, I would remember all the pleasure. I would remember the high. I would remember the false peace of mind that I would get when I was under the influence of alcohol. And it's the same thing that happens with almost every alcoholic and drug abuser that I know. In time, most of us begin to forget how bad it used to be unless we do something to remember. And of course, that's what good alcoholism and drug education is supposed to do. It's supposed to help us remember or teach us the very important principles of recovery that we continue to learn on an ongoing basis. So let me introduce you to the progressive nature of addiction. And of course, the addiction is represented by a baby sleeping tiger. Okay? My tiger began to grow in my life at about 13 years. It began to grow. It started off as a very little tiny tiger inside of me, somewhere in my late teens and in my early 20s. And when that happened and my tiger got formed, I became an alcoholic person. There was a point in time in my life when I was an alcoholic and I drank alcohol, and at a point in time I crossed the invisible line into addiction or alcoholism, and that's when my baby tiger was born. You see, in my case, in my own particular life, there was a time when I believe I drank non-alcoholically and I had no tiger inside of me. But the day that I crossed the line, the invisible line, into alcoholic drinking, okay, or the day that I became alcoholic, whenever that happened, that was the day that my little tiger was conceived. And it began to grow, and it grew and it grew and it grew inside of me, and I didn't know it. In those years, I could drink and I could handle it most of the times, but more and more I began to get into more and more problems with my drinking. More and more symptoms of alcoholism began to appear in my own life. Well, unbeknownst to me, my tiger was growing up on the inside. And by the time I was 26, 27, 28 years old, this is what my tiger looked like. See, I was much more handsome in those years. See, this is supposed to be a picture of me. And can you picture me at about 26, 27 years old? My tiger had grown from infancy to about this size, and obviously I'm just using this as an illustration. And I lived in total darkness on the inside of me. By the time I became a full-blown alcoholic and became aware of the condition in my own life, I became aware of my own dependency on the chemical ethyl alcohol. Okay, my life was totally unmanageable, and my baby tiger had grown to quite a proportion. And it was awake, and it was alive, and it was well. And obviously, the thing that kept it awake was the continued use of chemicals. The continued use of alcohol will keep the tiger awake. The continued use of cocaine will keep the tiger awake. The continued use of pot will keep the tiger awake. The continued use of any mind-altering chemicals will keep our friend awake. And obviously, at 27 and 28, my tiger was well awake, and it was tearing my life up. It caused all kinds of havoc in my own life. Loss of wife, loss of self-respect, loss of everything. And it took me to a place where I had to do something about my drinking problem. I had to become willing to stop drinking. I had to become teachable. I had to become so mixed up and so screwed up in my own life because of my tiger that was on the inside of me that was awoke or awakened. Every time I drank it, it would just keep growing and growing and growing, and it got bigger and bigger, and I finally admitted, okay, I give up. I'm an alcoholic. I can't drink anymore. I'm willing to be sober. I'm willing to get help. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I didn't know I had a sleeping tiger inside of me. See? All I knew is that every time I drank, I'd get drunk, or something awful would happen, and my life had become totally unmanageable. So, at age 27 and 28, I finally became willing to stop drinking and stop using drugs, and guess what happened? See? I thought that if I would quit drinking and get sober and get help, that I would get cured of my alcoholism. See? I thought, because I had the wrong understanding, that if I would stop drinking and stop using drugs, if I would become abstinent like other people that I met, I thought I would be cured. I've seen people that haven't had a drink for 25 and 35 years. I thought they were cured of their addiction. Well, unbeknownst to me, when I stopped drinking, my tiger didn't go away, it went to sleep. See? Now we're going to begin to understand the real nature of progression. The real nature of progression doesn't mean that your tiger goes away when you stop drinking. It simply means that you put it to sleep. In other words, when an alcoholic or a drug abuser chooses a lifestyle of abstinence from all mind-altering chemicals and even gets into recovery with the help of other people, the illness doesn't go away, it simply goes to sleep. This is what we call an alcoholic in remission, or alcoholism in the arrested state. Obviously, our tiger is still about the same size that it was when I first put it to sleep, but it's sleeping now, and you can see that I'm a little happier about that. See, it was really nice to learn how to live without the use of chemicals. And in my own particular case, I got into a fellowship of people that began to help me deal with the issues of life so that I could keep the tiger from waking up. Now I need to show you a picture of me about 5 years later. Now I'm 32 years old, and I'm 5 years abstinent, which means I haven't had a drink or any mind-altering chemicals for 5 whole years. You can see I'm a little bit more handsome, and my life has really turned around at this point, and I've gotten a lot of things back that I lost in my drinking. I'm in a business now, and I'm driving a nice new car, and everything's getting better, and I've been in recovery for 5 years. Do you notice that my tiger has grown proportionately in those 5 years, even while it's sleeping? Remember, progression? The disease of chemical dependency progressively grows even inside of the individual who is no longer drinking and using drugs. See? In other words, my disease of alcoholism inside of me is growing while I'm physically sober. But it's sleeping at the same time. In fact, it's sleeping rather well, but it's growing and growing and growing. This is at 5 years sober. See, my life has really changed. There are no outward symptoms of my chemical dependency. I don't feel like taking a drink. I don't have an obsessional urge to drink and use drugs because my illness is in the arrested state. It's in remission. See? But the most important thing to realize is while it's in the arrested state and while it's in remission, it's growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. See? Now, your job and my job, if you're chemically dependent like I am, is to keep the tiger sleeping. See, as long as I didn't pick up a drink, as long as I didn't use any mind-altering substance, my tiger would continue to sleep, even though it's getting bigger. I don't care if it gets as big as a whole house. I mean, why should I care as long as it's sleeping? See? But what do you think one drink would do? See? What do you think one toke on a marijuana cigarette would do? What do you think one hit on cocaine would do to this sleeping tiger? We don't want to do that. We want to keep it sleeping. So I did. I kept it sleeping, and I was 5 years here, and all of a sudden, wham, I'm 10 years sober. I'm 38 years old. See? A little bit more sophisticated now. Now I own a business. See, now I'm married, and I have a couple of kids. And my whole life has changed. And I keep sharing with everybody else I know. Recovery works. I haven't had a drink or used anything for 10 years. Isn't that a miracle for a person like me? And for 10 years, my tiger has been growing. Look how big it is now. See? I don't see this tiger inside of me. In fact, I didn't even know about it. See? Nevertheless, it was there because the addiction continues to grow. If you're an alcoholic or you're a drug abuser, and you have a sleeping tiger inside of you like I do, don't wake it up. Because if you wake it up, it'll be as if you never had a break in the amount of problems that have manifested in your life. See, if I should wake up my tiger today, it won't be like it was when I was 28 years old and I put it to sleep. If I wake it up at 10 years sober, that tiger is going to tear me up. I've seen this happen countless hundreds and hundreds of times at meetings that I've been involved with. People who are fortunate enough to get back into the program after having had a period of abstinence. I've seen people with 2-3 years go out and drink again if they're lucky enough to get back. Listen to their stories. Okay? Every time I hear somebody that gets back after having a period of abstinence who drank or used drugs, when they come back, they all have the same story. Don't do it. It gets worse. For God's sakes, don't do it. It gets worse. It always gets worse. That's what the yets mean. If it hasn't happened, well, it hasn't happened yet. But don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, your disease of chemical dependency is getting bigger and growing larger inside of you right this minute. Okay? We don't know how much it'll progress. We don't know how fast it will progress. What we do know is that it does progress. Let's take a look and see what I look like at 15 years sober. Notice I have a mustache now. I really got sophisticated. See, I'm 15 years abstinent now, and my disease of chemical dependency has been growing and growing and growing and growing. My God, look how big it is. What would happen if I woke this thing up? What would happen if I took one drink? Can the first drink really get an alcoholic drunk? Okay, can the first pull on a marijuana cigarette really wake up the tiger in a chemically dependent person? Okay, if I took one drink right now, would I get crazy blind drunk, or would I simply wake up my tiger? And then what would happen if I did wake it up? Okay, what kinds of things do you think would happen to me today if I woke my tiger up after being free from all alcohol and mind-altering drugs for 15 years? How big has my tiger gotten? I don't know. See, we don't know how fast it progresses. We don't know how much it progresses. What we do know is that it progresses. See? Well, let's take a look and see what might happen. This is as far as I go with my story. What I'm going to share from this point forward is what could happen. What could happen to you? What could happen to you? If you're a chemically dependent person and you're entertaining the idea of social drinking or social drug use, and you've had a period of abstinence, this could happen to you. Okay, a friend of mine who is a doctor, who lived back east, who I met when I first got into recovery some 15 years ago, had something like 15 to 16 years of sobriety when I first met him. In other words, he found out he had an alcohol problem when he was a very young man. He immediately got help. He immediately put the plug in the jug and became a responsible doctor, and got married and had a tremendous practice in a small town on the East Coast. And I knew him for about 5 years after I got in the program. When he was about 21 years sober, he began to entertain the thought, well, I don't really believe that I have a progressive illness. Nobody's proven it. This was 15 years ago. There wasn't any scientific proof. There wasn't anything that could be conclusively proven to the fact that alcoholism and or chemical dependency was progressive. And he began to doubt it. And that doubt began to play on him. And he began to entertain the idea of trying to drink again or trying to be a normal drinker again after 21 years of sobriety. See, unbeknownst to him, his disease of alcoholism was progressively getting worse for 21 years while it was sleeping. But he didn't believe it. See, he didn't buy it. He didn't buy the concept. He did develop a rationale, and he said, if I do drink again, and it really is progressive, and it does get worse, I will immediately stop drinking and get right back in the program. Doesn't that make sense? That's perfectly logical to a non-alcoholic. It's perfectly logical to a person who doesn't understand addiction to rationally support the idea, after being abstinent for 21 years, that if it does pose a problem, I will immediately stop and get right back in the program again. So what's the big deal? What's the big deal about having a slip? Well, my friend the doctor talked that way for about 3 months. He didn't do it, but he talked about it. He began to fantasize on the whole idea of taking the first drink. He began to remember the pleasure that he got from drinking. And of course, 21 years of forgetting. To the point where he talked himself into taking the first drink. And he started off by taking 2 glasses of wine. Can you imagine me, after 15 years of sobriety, taking 2 glasses of wine? What do you think would happen? Well, the doctor did not get drunk after 2 glasses of wine. In fact, he had 2 glasses of wine the first day, and he had about 4 or 5 glasses of wine the second day, and he didn't get drunk on the second day. And his whole life didn't cave in. And he said, see, it's not progressive. See, he had proven conclusively to himself, after having a little bit of alcohol the first day and a little bit of alcohol the second day, that the whole idea of having a progressive illness was a bunch of baloney. Okay? Guess what happened 10 days later? He blew his brains out with a shotgun in a blackout in a motel room with whiskey bottles in every corner of the room. What's the moral of the story? The first drink doesn't get us physically drunk. The first hit on a funny cigarette doesn't get us physically wiped out. The first use of alcohol and drugs doesn't necessarily mean we wind up becoming a total monster right away. What it does mean is the first use of alcohol or drugs wakes up the sleeping tiger. And this is what would happen to me if I took a drink. It's pretty scary, isn't it? In other words, when I put my tiger to sleep 15 years ago, it was a little tiny baby cub. And it caused a lot of problems in my life. But here I am with 15 years abstinence, and I take one drink, and I may not get drunk right away, but what does the tiger do, which has been growing for 15 years? The tiger takes over the person. Okay? In other words, the illness wakes up at a degree of progression which is uncanny in the person who is chemically dependent. This is what happened to the doctor. The doctor had the first glass of wine on the first day, and his tiger woke up. It took his tiger 10 days to get him to blow his brains out with a shotgun. How many times do you think I've seen other people in the last 15 years who are fortunate enough to get back after a relapse, and they all have the same thing to say? What do you think it is? Don't do it. It gets worse. Don't wake up the tiger. Don't buy it. Don't pick up the first drink. Okay? Don't do it. Whatever you think hasn't happened to you yet. Okay? Very, very important to understand. The yets will happen to a person who continues to allow his tiger to be awake. All of the yets will happen. Ultimately, what will happen to the person who allows his tiger to be awake will be death, insanity, or institutionalism. Those are the only three alternatives to a person who suffers from chemical dependency. And of course, the other course is recovery. With the help of other people, with the ability to keep the physical illness arrested, with the ability to recover psychologically and spiritually, with the help of other people, and a program on an ongoing idea, on an ongoing basis, anybody can recover. But recovery doesn't mean that we're cured. Recovery simply means we keep this baby sleeping, one day at a time for the rest of our lives. And that's what recovery is all about. So that's my message. I really appreciate you being here today, and thank you for that. And with that, we'll close. Hi, my name is Chuck Brissett, and I'm here to share with you today some new ideas relative to the disease of alcoholism, which is illustrated by the three-headed dragon. The threefold barrier to recovery from alcoholism is best illustrated by the proper understanding, which is a teaching aid rather than a therapeutic device. The first head on the dragon, obviously, is drinking.
And the second head on the dragon is thinking. And the third head on the dragon is feelings. So obviously, drinking, thinking, and feelings represents the threefold nature of denial. And denial is the most difficult thing to deal with when dealing with an alcoholic. So denial to the addiction. The three-headed dragon concept is relevant to any kind of chemical dependency as well as alcohol. And basically what it represents is, oftentimes, as you know, the alcoholic will very often admit his problem and deny the need for the solution. The solution being recovery, or those things that are relevant to recovery, which means change of self, when in most cases the alcoholic wants to change things outside of himself in order to recover from the thinking and the feeling factors. So the three-headed dragon is a representative technique that illustrates the importance to understand the ism in alcoholism. In other words, alcoholism in itself is an addiction to the chemical alcohol, which is representative by the first head on the dragon. The thinking and feeling factor isn't really associated with alcoholism directly, but always goes along with it. Okay, so the recovery process, which is the ism in alcoholism, has to be generated from the thinking and the feelings of an alcoholic. But in most cases, the alcoholic denies the need to deal with his thinking and his feelings because he doesn't know that there's anything wrong with him in the first place. Most of you know that many alcoholics who are drinking and getting into trouble with their families, their wives, their employers, their friends, the law, and whoever, very often will deny the existence of their drinking problem. I know this happened to me for a number of years. And the funny part about it is that I believed in my own denial. In other words, a lot of people were saying, Chuck, you've got to do something about your drinking problem, or you're an alcoholic, or you've got to slow down, or cut it out and change your ways. And I can remember many times while going through this process of confrontation, I would deny the existence of a drinking problem. And furthermore, I believed my own denial. The first head on the three-headed dragon is the only factor that really has to do with alcoholism. In other words, when the individual becomes addicted to the chemical alcohol, he's then called an alcoholic. Now, there are some interesting facts about the disease of alcoholism, one of which is that it is a chronic, progressive, irreversible disease. If I have a chronic disease, what does that mean?
Something lifelong?
Something that's lifelong. Once I become an alcoholic, I will be an alcoholic for the rest of my life. It's as simple as that. What does the word irreversible mean? Okay. Okay, right. In other words, once I become an alcoholic for the rest of my life, I can never become a non-alcoholic. You've all heard the story about the cucumber that gets turned into a pickle. Well, obviously, it can't be turned back into a cucumber again. And a person who becomes alcoholic, once that process has started within his own system, he can never become a non-alcoholic. The only thing that he can do is to be an active alcoholic or an arrested alcoholic. Well, what does the word arrest mean in the sense of alcoholism? It means put it to sleep. In other words, we can't get rid of it, but we can put it to sleep. I can't get rid of my alcoholism even though I've been sober almost 11 years. Okay? But my disease has been asleep for 11 years, and it hasn't affected me physically because I have chosen not to pick up the first drink to wake it up. Okay? Which leads us into the third factor on the first head on the dragon, which is progressive, which in most cases is misunderstood. Now, what do I mean by progressive? If I have a chronic, irreversible, progressive disease called alcoholism, what do I mean when I say progressive?
It's worse, never better.
Oh, it gets worse, never better. Have you ever seen somebody that had a period of sobriety drink and then come back again and tell you how awful it was and it's worse than it ever got before? It was harder to get sober, the blackouts were quicker, it was, more problems arise quickly. The mental and the emotional dysfunction happens sooner. The remorse and guilt and the whole thing. So obviously the first barrier that the alcoholic has to get through is the number one denial, or the denial of the first head on the dragon, which is drinking. And eventually, most of us will come to a point where we become aware of the fact that we do have a drinking problem and may label it alcoholic. Now, oftentimes this is called hitting bottom. Many alcoholics have to go through a series of circumstances, in most cases, before they become willing to take a look at themselves. And eventually the breakthrough comes, and the denial of the first head on the dragon ceases to exist. And one might say, aha, I discovered now I'm an alcoholic. That's my problem, alcohol. And become willing to stop drinking. What he very effectively has done is he has eliminated the first head on the three-headed dragon. Now, herein lies where most alcoholics stop in the recovery process. Is it possible that the act of physically stopping drinking is not the whole answer to the recovery process from alcoholism? Is it possible that an alcoholic might be able to put the plug in the jug and experience physical sobriety, but still carry 2/3 of his problem with him everywhere he goes, even though he's sober? Can you see this vicious cycle? Alcoholic gets sober, chops off the first head on the dragon, doesn't become aware of the second and the third head on the dragon, so doesn't do anything about it. Carries 2/3 of his problem with him into everything he does. Can you picture that? Can you picture an alcoholic who isn't drinking carrying 2/3 of his problem into a new job? What happens on the new job? He gets drunk. Can you picture an alcoholic putting the plug in the jug and carrying 2/3 of his problem with him into a new relationship? And what does he discover about the new relationship? It doesn't make him feel better, it makes him feel worse. Let me share a little story about that I learned. I was in my third alcoholism institution, and I wasn't there for dandruff, I was there for drinking. Okay? And I spent 6 weeks in this institution, and I became willing to do everything that I was told. I admitted that I was an alcoholic. I accepted the fact that I was an alcoholic. And after 6 weeks, I graduated from the program sober. And I went into a recovery home that was in that community, and I got a job. And things really started to get better for me. I was going to meetings in the community to help myself. I was admitting that I was an alcoholic. I was doing all the right things, and I was getting a lot of good feelings, and things were starting to really work out great for me. And I'd been trying to get sober for a couple of years at that time. But after I was out of the institution for about 4 weeks, I met a girl. And I asked her out for a date, which is perfectly normal, isn't it, for a recovering guy, single? And she said, fine, I'd love to go out with you. And I was elated. And I looked forward all week long to going out on a date with this girl that Saturday night, and I was feeling good, and I was going to my meetings, and I was gung-ho. And I knew I was an alcoholic. I knew I had a disease. I knew what was going to happen to me if I drank, and I was not going to drink, and everything was going to be okay. Now, guess what happened Friday evening? The phone went ding-a-ling-a-ling, and I picked it up, and guess who was on the other end? The girl that I was to take out the next night. And she said, Chuck, my mother just died, and I have to go to Nebraska, and I can't go out with you tomorrow night. I'm sorry. Okay? And I'm on the other end of the phone, and guess what happened to me? Some lump went from my mouth down to my stomach. And within 30 seconds, I was completely negative. I was absolutely destroyed emotionally. I became paranoid. I automatically believed that she made up the story just because she didn't want to go out with me, because I was no good. And my emotions completely turned around. I slid into the fastest depression that I'd ever fell into in my life, and I was full of self-pity within 2 hours, hating the girl. Now, that can't happen to a normal, rational human being, can it? That fast? Okay? Now, let me add to the story. On top of that, I nursed that self-pity for another 4 hours. And all of a sudden, I started collecting, like a magnet, a lot of other negative things that I had since dropped while I was in the program. And within 6 hours, I was the worst person on the face of the earth. I was totally alone, no good, rejected, completely crazy, and in a barroom. Now, if you can picture me in this condition, sitting in a bar room, ordering a double shot of Canadian Club, sitting there staring at it. Okay? Now, I'm sitting there staring at the double shot of Canadian Club, and my head is telling me, Chuck, don't pick up the first drink. You're an alcoholic, and you know what's going to happen. Chuck, you know you have a progressive disease, and you know within 1 to 2 days exactly where you'll be at if you pick this drink up. You'll either be in jail or on an airplane cross-country writing hot checks, okay, or in a hospital or in a police station, because this is always what happens to you when you're an alcoholic. That's what the head is telling me. The head is telling me there are other alternatives besides drinking, like call somebody or ask for help, reach out, talk about your feelings, don't panic, surrender it. My head's telling me all these things, but what do you think my gut is telling me, my feelings, as I'm staring at that double shot of Canadian Club? Kill the pain at all costs. Doesn't make any difference what's going to happen to you. It doesn't make any difference what kind of price you pay. It doesn't make any difference what you know and what you don't know, Chuck. All you know is that you've got to have relief from that fear, that resentment, that awful terror that is inside that makes you feel like you're rejected by everybody in the whole world. So, the gut is pulling me one way, and the head is pulling me another way, and I'm going back and forth for 20 minutes sitting at that bar, staring at that drink. Guess who won out? My gut won out. My emotions won out. My emotions won out, and I picked up the drink, and I was in jail 2 days later. Broke, sick, full of self-pity, and worse off than I was before. The moral of this whole story, at least as it relates to the alcoholic, is that his feelings are more powerful than his intellect. If my feelings are the problem, now that I'm a recovering sober alcoholic, what good is it going to do me to get a head full of intellectual information if that information doesn't do something to change my feelings? Okay, have you ever seen a guy or a woman who is alcoholic desperately trying to learn how to stay sober, reading one book after another, seeking answers all over the place to learn how to stay sober, but not dealing with his or her feelings? Do you know why they don't deal with their feelings? Because they don't know they're supposed to deal with their feelings. No one ever told me in the beginning of my sobriety that part of my alcoholism had to do with the way I felt. I thought it was the way I felt when I was drinking that was the problem. Then I discovered it's the way I felt after I stopped drinking that was the problem. So obviously the solution has to have, at least at part, something to do with the feelings. The second head on the dragon is the way the alcoholic thinks. It's intellectual. The thinking factor in the denial process is called self-deception. What is the nature of self-deception as it relates to a person who is now sober and alcoholic at the same time? Is it possible that the alcoholic has lost his ability to be honest with himself and doesn't know it? Now, how can that happen? Okay, how can a human being lose his ability to be honest with himself, thus develop a great deal of self-dishonesty, and not know what's happening to him at the same time? Is that the same thing as honestly being dishonest? Have you ever seen somebody defend his right to hold on to the attitudes and beliefs that he wants to, and at the same time it's destroying him, and he can't see it within himself? That's the nature of self-deception. Self-deception allows the alcoholic to continue to operate with his old beliefs, his old attitudes, his old ideas, his old values, even though he's not drinking anymore, not being aware of the fact that these beliefs, attitudes, and values could be totally destructive to his chances of staying sober. Because that is the ism in alcoholism. So obviously self-deception has to be discovered and uncovered before a person can move on in the recovery process, which is the second barrier. Remember, the first barrier is drinking. But once the individual stops drinking, he begins to be confronted by the second barrier, which is his way of thinking, his system of beliefs. For instance, my system of beliefs, when I was confronted with the same issue some years back, came out something like this. If I could find the right job and make the right kind of money now that I'm sober, I'll be okay. If I could find the right relationship with the opposite sex now that I'm sober, I will be okay. If I could find the right place to live and drive the right kind of car and have the right kind of friends and get the right kind of breaks now that I'm sober, I know I'm going to be okay. Now, is it possible that by doing this, is it possible that I was suffering from self-deception? Do you think that there are a lot of alcoholics who get sober and follow that same line of thinking? If I could get my wife back, if I could get my old job back, if I could get the police off my back, if I could get the judge off my back, if, what's that, the if-only syndrome? What I'm really saying is, I feel terrible, and if I can change something outside of myself, I'll be okay. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the right intentions, but the wrong direction. Because the alcoholic who keeps seeking external change for his sobriety will always get drunk again. Are you starting to understand why the three-headed dragon? Why the threefold barrier to recovery? If an individual doesn't know about self-deception and doesn't see it within himself, is he going to reach out for help from other people to get rid of it? No. He'll suffer from the classical symptom of self-deception that most alcoholics suffer from, and that is, I don't have any. I'm different. I really mean it. I am different. You don't understand. If you had my problems, you'd do the same thing that I do. What am I doing? I'm rationalizing, I'm justifying, and I'm making excuses, not for my drinking, because I already put the plug in the jug, for my thinking. And until I become ready, willing, and able, through awareness, to recognize that my right way of thinking is what got me here. See, it wasn't my wrong way of thinking that got me here. It was my right way of thinking that got me here. It's my right way of thinking that drives me bananas after I stop drinking in a certain amount of time until I become willing to deal with it. So obviously, if it's my right way of thinking that got me here, what do I have to learn to get rid of? My right way of thinking. I used to think it was my wrong way of thinking that I had to get rid of. Lo and behold, it wasn't my wrong way of thinking, it was my whole way of thinking. Now, are my feelings the same thing as my intellect? Or is it possible that I can know one thing and feel just the opposite? Or I can feel one thing and know just the opposite? That's the third hit on the dragon. Why are my feelings getting worse now that I'm sober when everybody else has been telling me they're supposed to get better? I didn't know that my feelings were now surfacing because I wasn't pushing them down anymore with alcohol. I wasn't putting them to sleep anymore with alcohol. So they obviously had to surface. And as they surfaced, I started to feel pain, emotional pain. Now, what kind of emotional pain am I talking about? Fear, anxiety, depression, anger. How about loneliness? Is that one of them? Isn't that one of the classical symptoms of an alcoholic who is dry but not sober? Who begins to experience more and more and more loneliness in his sobriety and begins to wonder why this is happening to him and immediately starts trying to grab something outside of himself to fill that loneliness. And regardless of whether he gets it or not, what happens? He becomes lonelier. It doesn't matter what he gets or what he changes outside of himself, because his problem is not external, his problem is internal. His problem is that he doesn't know what's wrong with him. Okay? He doesn't understand what his problem is. His problem is that he has never grown up along emotional lines, which simply means that he's still an emotional child in a man's body or a woman's body and is reacting to the degree of immaturity within himself. But if he doesn't know it, is he going to become willing to deal with it in the proper way? Okay? So do we then have a situation where we might suggest that if the alcoholic knew better, he could do better? The reason that I feel terrible after I get sober physically is because I am now becoming aware of the fact that I've never grown up emotionally. But I don't know that. Nobody ever told me that I never grew up emotionally. Or if anybody did, I wasn't listening anyway. Or if I was listening, I didn't understand it. So obviously the third head on the dragon, or the third factor in the denial syndrome or denial process, is the denial of emotional immaturity. Is it possible that I could honestly be dishonest about my emotional immaturity and not believe it? And if I didn't believe it, is it possible that I would continue to blame things outside of myself for the way I feel now that I'm sober? If I continue to do that, is it possible that I will develop a greater fear of staying sober than I will of the consequences of drinking? You want me to run that one by again? Because it's the key to this whole talk. The alcoholic has the unique ability to develop a greater fear of staying sober than he does of the consequences of drinking, even though he knows and admits that he's an alcoholic. Remember me sitting at the bar, knowing that I was an alcoholic? Knowing what would happen to me if I picked up the first drink, but what did I do anyway? I picked up the first drink because I was powerless over my feelings, not my intellect. And the alcoholic is powerless over his feelings. Combine the degree of emotional immaturity that manifests itself in the alcoholic, and obviously that's different amounts for different people. Some of us completely stop our emotional growth. Others of us just stunt it. I'm not saying across the board all alcoholics don't grow up emotionally. I'm saying that to a degree we all stop or stunt our emotional growth, and we don't recognize it until we stop using the chemicals. Then it surfaces because we become aware of it. Can you picture an alcoholic putting the plug in the jug with the help of other people, can't do it by himself, discovering his own self-deception with the help of other people, can't do that alone either, and at the same time learning how to play catch-up baseball with his emotions? In other words, part of the goal of recovery from alcoholism, dealing with the third head on the dragon, is when I recognize my need to allow myself to grow up along emotional lines as the solution to my bad feelings, rather than changing things outside of myself. Can you see the trap that a lot of us can fall into? After we get sober and start getting in touch with all of this pain, we have a tendency to want to run out here and change things. Change the car we drive, change the place we live, change the people we're dating, change the job, the money, and everything else. When in reality, the only thing that we have the ability to change is ourselves. Is that my problem as an alcoholic? Through self-deception, which means I don't know what's happening, I have been stopping or stunting, third head on the dragon, my emotional growth all of my life. And now that I've put the plug in the jug and discovered that I'm miserable, I'm beginning to see my real problem for the first time in my life. You know what happens to alcoholics who discover this? They stay sober and get well, because now they know what's wrong with them. If I didn't know about the second head on the dragon and the third head on the dragon, if I didn't know about my own self-deception and my own emotional immaturity, would I accept your solution to deal with these two things if I didn't think I had the problem? Would that be denial? Okay? Do most alcoholics deny the need for the solution? You bet your life. Flip it over on the other side and talk about recovery. And all of a sudden we begin to see three factors in recovery that need to also happen. The first one is to stop drinking. The second one is to develop self-honesty on an ongoing basis with the help of other people. The third one is to grow up emotionally and know why. You put all three of those things together and you've got one solution called recovery. Recovery from alcoholism obviously is just not drinking. It's not drinking, developing self-honesty, growing up along emotional lines. So as we see the three-headed dragon being a threefold problem, we then begin to see the three-headed dragon as a threefold solution. Keep in mind that the alcoholic that tries to deal with this solution by himself will probably be unsuccessful. But with the addition of help from other people, with the alcoholic's understanding of his own need for an ongoing program of recovery, he has an excellent chance of maintaining a good, solid, sober recovery. And that's the truth. Thank you.
That within 4 years, Ince had his own studio and considerable power. He became one of Hollywood's first creative producers, and all his films, whether he wrote, directed, or edited them, bore his own stamp.